A few weeks ago, something big happened, but it didn't make many headlines. The U.S. military arrived in Ghana, not with speeches or lectures, but with gifts. 14 armored vehicles, sleek, intimidating, and powerful. A gesture of goodwill, they said, a sign of the strong partnership between the United States and Ghana. But just days later, everything changed. In a move that stunned many across the continent, Ghana's president didn't return the favor with praise. Instead, he hit back, hard. In a statement published by The Guardian, President John Mahama directly criticized the United States, not just for meddling in African affairs, but for something far more audacious, trying to rewrite Africa's history. Yes, you heard that right. While Washington talks about democracy and cooperation, Africa's leaders are beginning to see the shadows behind the smiles. And this time, President Mahama didn't stay silent. His words weren't just bold, they were historic. The kind of defiance we rarely see, but deeply crave in African leadership. In today's video, we're breaking it all down. The U.S. military presence in Ghana, the deeper meaning behind Mahama's explosive statement, and what this moment says about the future of African sovereignty. Because what's happening right now is bigger than diplomacy. It's a battle for history, for identity, and for the soul of the continent. A few weeks ago, the world watched as South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped into the White House for a meeting with Donald Trump. Officially, it was meant to ease tensions, a diplomatic handshake to calm the storm brewing between South Africa and the United States. But what unfolded behind closed doors was anything but peaceful. From the moment the cameras started rolling, it was clear. Trump had an agenda. He wasn't interested in nuance or diplomacy. No, he was there to confront Ramaphosa with a narrative he firmly believed, that white South Africans were being hunted, victims of what he called white genocide. To make his case, Trump didn't cite policy. He didn't reference facts. Instead, he played videos, including one of Julius Malema, leader of the EFF, chanting the controversial "Kill the Boer" song. It was political theater, raw and aggressive. And through it all, President Ramaphosa was forced onto the defensive. He later claimed the meeting ended well, but the truth? It was painfully obvious. Trump never backed down from his claims. Not even when South Africa's Democratic Alliance, a party with a largely white voter base, publicly dismissed the idea of white genocide as utter nonsense. And while most African leaders stayed quiet, one voice broke through the silence. Ghana's president, John Mahama. Unapologetically Pan-African and unshaken by Western politics, Mahama did what few others dared. He spoke, not just for Ghana, but for South Africa, and for the dignity of Africans everywhere. His words were sharp, unfiltered, and deliberate. In the face of global misinformation, he chose clarity. In the face of silence, he chose courage. In today's video, we break down that meeting, the racial politics behind it, and why President Mahama's stand may be one of the most powerful moments of Pan-African leadership in recent years. Because this wasn't just a political clash, it was a battle over the truth, and the fight for Africa's voice on the global stage. It was a statement that echoed across the continent, sharp, unapologetic, and long overdue. In a move that stunned many and inspired millions, President John Mahama of Ghana broke his silence. And when he spoke, he didn't mince words. He called Donald Trump's claims of a so-called white genocide in South Africa not just false, but an outright insult to every African. But this wasn't just about fact-checking a former U.S. president. No, this was about something deeper, something darker. According to Mahama, Trump wasn't just spreading misinformation. He was attempting to do what colonizers and apologists have tried to do for centuries, rewrite African history. And if you stop and think about it, it hits hard. For over 200 years, Black South Africans endured colonization. Then came apartheid, a brutal, calculated system of racial segregation that lasted nearly half a century. Entire communities were torn apart, families destroyed, protesters gunned down. And through it all, the world stood by in silence. No U.S. president spoke of genocide then. No outcry from Western leaders. Instead, the very man who led the anti-apartheid movement, Nelson Mandela, was branded a terrorist and thrown in prison for 27 years, placed on America's terror watch list for daring to demand freedom. Fast forward to today, and suddenly, without evidence, the story has flipped. A new narrative pushed by Donald Trump, that white South Africans are now the victims of a hidden genocide. And somehow, the world listens. President Mahama saw through it. He called it what it was, not just a lie, but a dangerous distortion. A weaponized narrative designed to twist the past and stain the present. In his powerful statement, Mahama wrote, "It is not enough to be affronted by these claims, or to casually dismiss them as untruths." These statements are a clear example of how language can be leveraged to extend the effects of previous injustices. This mode of violence has long been used against indigenous Africans, and it cannot simply be met with silence, not anymore. This isn't just about Trump, it's about the power of words, the violence of false history, and the refusal of African leaders to let the truth be rewritten, again. These are not just words, they are a call to arms. A truth that every Pan-African, every freedom fighter, and every believer in the dignity of this continent must take seriously. For far too long, Africa's story has been written by outsiders, by those who carved borders with no regard for history, who took resources and left behind ruins, and who now use their platforms to reshape Africa's image through selective headlines and whispered lies. They say Africa cannot govern itself. They say colonization brought order. They say we are poor, needy, forever dependent on foreign aid and foreign mercy. And the world? It believed them. Because for decades, Africans chose silence over confrontation. Because too often, we turned the other cheek, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. But as President John Mahama boldly declared, not anymore. In his address, Mahama reminded us of something fundamental. African nations learned long ago that their fates are inextricably linked. When it comes to interactions with the world beyond our continent, we are each other's bellwether. In other words, if one African nation is under attack, all are under attack. If one is disrespected, all are disrespected. And if one stands tall, all should rise with it. But somewhere along the way, we forgot. Instead of unity, we've embraced isolation. Instead of solidarity, we've grown indifferent. African nations now look inward, minding their own business, as if that's enough to survive in a world that still sees us as expendable. But that's not even the worst part. Because in the silence, in the division, the old narratives return, stronger, louder, more dangerous. And unless Africa rises with one voice, we risk letting the past rewrite our future. But instead of rising together, we've witnessed something far more tragic and far more dangerous. African nations, once bound by a shared struggle, are now turning on each other, not just with words, but with weapons. Take ECOWAS, for example, the West African bloc that should symbolize regional unity and defense. When Niger's military took a bold step towards sovereignty, it wasn't France that led the charge against them. It was ECOWAS, backed by France. Yes, African soldiers, prepared to fight another African nation, not to defend their people, but to uphold the interests of former colonizers. Even worse, Ivory Coast, once a proud nation of resistance, is now reportedly working alongside French operatives and Burkinabe traders, plotting to destabilize Burkina Faso, a country fighting not for conquest, but for survival, for dignity, for independence. This is the Africa we face today, an Africa where alliances are fractured, where loyalty to old empires outweighs solidarity with neighbors, where betrayal comes not from abroad, but from within. And yet, not all is lost. In a moment of profound reflection, President John Mahama reminded the world of what real Pan-Africanism looks like. He recalled a time when Ghana's freedom wasn't celebrated with isolation, but with a call to action. In 1957, he wrote, "The year before my birth, Ghana became the first Black African country to free itself from colonialism. After the Union Jack had been lowered, our first Prime Minister, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, gave a speech in which he emphasized that our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." Those words weren't just poetic, they were prophetic. Because Nkrumah knew, freedom for one African nation means little if others remain in chains. Mahama's reminder is not just about history, it's about the urgent need to reclaim the spirit of unity that once electrified the continent. In today's fractured Africa, only a few nations have truly become each other's bellwether. But the vision is clear. A continent where no African leader stands alone, where no country is left to fight its battles in the dark, and where sovereignty isn't a solo pursuit, but a shared mission. Then came 1960, and with it, tragedy. In South Africa, the Sharpeville massacre shook the world. 69 black South Africans gunned down, over 100 more wounded, unarmed, peaceful, protesters of apartheid. Thousands of miles away, in Ghana, the response was immediate. We marched, we protested, we sheltered the exiled and spoke for the silenced. And we weren't alone. From Accra to Algiers, sovereign African nations rose in solidarity. Because the people being murdered in the streets of South Africa looked like us. Because the pain of apartheid was not distant, it was familiar. We had faced our own versions of that same battle, and we knew. Their struggle was ours. It was a moment of continental consciousness, a time when Africa stood tall, shoulder to shoulder, with a shared fire in its soul. It was the last time Africa was truly awake. But then, silence, division, disillusionment. The decades that followed saw that fire dim, smothered by external control and internal betrayal. Africa fragmented. The dream faded. Until now. With the rise of President Ibrahim Traore and the AES alliance, something extraordinary is happening. A new generation of African leadership is defying the old order, unapologetic, unshaken, unafraid. They're not asking for permission. They're not begging for aid. They are lighting a fire, one that is spreading fast from the Sahel to the southern tip of the continent. This is the rebirth of African unity. And if we guard that flame, if we protect it with truth, courage, and unwavering solidarity, then maybe, just maybe, Africa will never fall asleep again. President Mahama didn't hold back. He reminded the world that South Africa's liberation wasn't handed over peacefully, it was fought for, and that fight was brutal. Thousands died. Many of them were children. Young lives cut short by bullets, by batons, by a system built on legalized racial hatred. A system so deeply rooted, so meticulously enforced, that it took decades of global protests, economic sanctions, and international outrage to finally bring it down. And yet, even as apartheid fell, the scars never truly healed. As Mahama said, it is the blood of the fallen and of their ancestors that soaks the soil of South Africa, a land freed, but never truly repaired. Because the truth is, the international community never paid a price. Not one Western power has offered reparations. Not for apartheid, not for colonization, not for the centuries of plunder and subjugation that built their modern wealth. And South Africa still bears the burden. Decades after apartheid's so-called end, white South Africans, less than 10% of the population, control over 70% of the nation's wealth. In some areas, there are still gated enclaves where only white South Africans can own land, run businesses, and build futures. Entire communities, off limits by race, in 2025. Let that sink in. Apartheid might be off the books, but it still lives in the bones of the nation. And yet, we hear no outrage from President Trump, no tweets from Elon Musk, no grand declarations about injustice, no calls for reparations or reform. Is it ignorance? Or is silence more convenient? Because when injustice favors the powerful, speaking up becomes optional. But when it threatens their narrative, suddenly it becomes a crisis. This is the double standard Africa knows all too well, and President Mahama is done pretending it doesn't exist. If you need proof that apartheid's legacy still lives on in South Africa, look no further than Kleinfontein, a secluded white-only community with a chilling landmark at its entrance. A massive bust of Hendrik Verwoerd, the former prime minister often called the architect of apartheid. That statue isn't just history, it's a symbol of pride for the people who live there. It tells us everything we need to know. They see nothing wrong with apartheid. They don't reject it, they honor it. And they're not alone. In the town of Orania, things are even more surreal. It's a separatist enclave where only white South Africans